Hello and welcome to the Witness History podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Mike Lanshin. Today we're going back to 1983 when Pope John Paul II visited Nicaragua at a time of strained relations between the left-wing Sandinista government and the country's Roman Catholic hierarchy. The Polish-born Pope, a committed anti-communist, was on an 8-day tour of Central America. But as I've been hearing, his short stay in Nicaragua was by far the most testing and controversial part of his trip.
The political problems began from the moment the Pope landed in Nicaragua. The revolutionary junta, after 4 years of power, finds itself in continual battle with the Catholic hierarchy. The Pope has ruled that Catholic priests shouldn't get involved in politics, but here there are no fewer than 5 Catholic clergy in the revolutionary government, despite Vatican pressure, and one of the rebels, the culture minister Ernesto Cardenal, gave an almost exaggeratedly humble greeting to his disapproving spiritual leader.
Father Cardinal knelt down and went to kiss the papal ring. The Pope was kind of taken aback by that.
Nancy Fraser O'Brien was the Vatican correspondent for the American Catholic News Service and was travelling with the Pope.
And the Pope pulled his hand away, started talking to him loudly. We couldn't hear what he was saying, of course, but he seemed to be chastising him.
To make his displeasure even clearer, the pontiff waved a reprimanding finger in Father Cardinal's face. The Jesuit priest later told the BBC what had happened.
He told me twice to regularize my situation. He said it in a very rude manner.
How did you feel?
I was surprised, because we didn't think the Pope would come and greet us. I also felt humiliated.
It was a very bad start to the papal visit. But it was also a sign of the turbulent relationship between the Vatican and some of Nicaragua's leading clergy, who had a very different view of the role of the Church.
Between Christianity and the revolution, the Sandinistas say there is no contradiction. In a poor neighborhood, they hold the Missa Campesina, the peasant mass, an example of the people's church in action. The revolution has taken a part of the church with it. The Mass has become politicized.
Since the late 1960s, the Catholic Church had been bitterly divided across much of Latin America. These were times of revolution, popular uprisings, and brutal military regimes in the region. Many priests and lay preachers were siding with the poor, and often being killed for speaking out. Central to the divide was liberation theology, a belief that the Church's mission was to foment social change and liberate the oppressed. Pope John Paul II regarded that as a Marxist distortion of Christian teaching. Carlos Penske, who once studied for the Catholic priesthood, was a leader of the so-called popular church that worked with Christian-based communities in Nicaragua in the 1980s. He'd also been involved in the Sandinista revolution that had overthrown the US-backed dictator, General Anastasio Somoza, in 1979.
We believed that the revolution was a way of creating the kingdom of God, although we knew it wasn't perfect. But as Christians, we believe we should support the revolution as a way of changing things for the better.
By the time Pope John Paul II was due to visit, Nicaraguan society as a whole was becoming more polarized. The country was in the throes of civil war, with attacks from US-funded Contra rebels trying to unseat the Sandinista government. But according to Carlos Penske, the Sandinista leadership was keen to avoid confrontation with the Pope.
The Sandinistas knew how much influence the church had, and they were taking care not to do anything that could provoke an incident. I think they wanted the visit to reflect well on the revolution and for the Pope to offer his support for our struggle, without saying it expressly.
But that was never likely to happen, says Catholic reporter Nancy Fraser O'Brien, especially after the welcoming address at the airport by the Sandinista leader, Daniel Ortega.
He asked the Pope to help Nicaragua fight American imperialism I think he called it aggressive imperialism. And Pope didn't really respond to that, but I thought personally that Ortega would be a little more diplomatic than he was.
The Pope's first public mass passed off without incident. But much to the annoyance of the Sandinista government, he didn't make any reference to an incident that had happened just days earlier, when a group of young army recruits were killed in a Contra ambush. The Sandinistas had asked the Pope to denounce the attack or meet the families of the young soldiers. By the afternoon, says Carlos Penske, there was an atmosphere of growing hostility surrounding the papal visit.
I was out on the streets waiting for the Pope to go by in his Pope-mobile. When he came along, we all shouted out, "Poder popular, power to the people," and raised our fists, as if to say, whatever you think, we'll stay firm in our convictions.
It was perhaps inevitable that things would eventually get out of hand. The Pope's last public appearance was another open-air mass in a large square in the capital, before a crowd of almost 900,000.
I had covered a lot of papal trips at that point, and I had never seen the Pope angry before. But when he was giving his homily, he was interrupted quite a number of times by people who were yelling, "We want a church that stands with us or stands with the poor." And he shushed them a few times, kind of. And then he got getting angry. He shouted back,
"Es obra y don de Jesucristo."
He thundered that the church should obey him and the bishops, not the group of Nicaraguan clergy who support the revolutionary junta. It didn't stop the heckling.
Was there a sense amongst you guys that it was sort of out of order what had happened, these people shouting and interrupting?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. The belief among the Vatican officials and the Vatican press corps was that it was organized. It was, the government was going to keep the pressure on the Pope the whole time that he was in the country.
Pope John Paul spent only 11 hours in all in Nicaragua, time enough for his visit to create a storm at home and abroad. He and his delegation returned for the night to Costa Rica, from where he continued his Central American tour the following day. So looking back, does Nancy Fraser O'Brien think that the Pope was misled or misinformed about what to expect?
I think the Pope was misled by either the Vatican officials or Nicaraguan church officials about what he could hope to accomplish and what kind of reception he would get. And, the Pope was certainly politically savvy. He knew from growing up in Poland that, things were never just pastoral or just political.
Pope John Paul II returned for a second visit to Nicaragua in February 1996. By then, the Sandinistas had been voted out of power, and a US-backed conservative government was in charge. Referring to his previous visit 13 years earlier, he said it had been a great dark night. Nancy Fraser O'Brien and Carlos Penske were speaking to me, Mike Lanchin, for this Witness History podcast. It was a CTVC production for the BBC World Service.